The United States Nestle company has advised me that their research indicates this is actually an indirect attack on the free world's economic system, a worldwide church organization with the stated purpose of undermining the free enterprise system is in the forefront of this activity.
Now, you can't seriously expect we'll be in order. We'll be in order now, please. We'll be in order. Today we'll focus on one small element of the problems. We'll focus on the use of a product intended to nourish life, to enable infants to thrive and grow, to see how it can have the unintended effects of fostering malnutrition and spreading disease. We'll focus on the advertising, marketing, and promotion and the use of infant formula in developing nations. Can a product which requires clean water, good sanitation, adequate family income, and a literate parent to follow printed instructions be properly and safely used in areas where water is contaminated, sewage runs in the streets, poverty is severe, and illiteracy is high?
Half of our children under 2 years of age are underweight by accepted North American standards. 1 to 2 in every 100 children are suffering from severe malnutrition. And by that I mean that if the children do not get immediate medical assistance, then they are likely to die. A half to 3/4 of the children who die in hospital die either directly due to malnutrition or from diseases that are directly associated with malnutrition.
You've come a long way to be with us. We want to hear your message. Now tell us just about the conditions in Peru.
In the jungle, we survive on the water that's contaminated in the river. I myself do that.
That's contaminated in the river?
Yeah, well, the river is used as the laundry, as the bathroom, as the toilet, and drinking water. That's the only source of water we have. Now, you can tell the mother, boil this milk, boil the water, even if you're going to give it to just as water, never mind mixing the formula. But to get the fuel, to boil that water, she has to go into the jungle, chop a real trunk with a machete, which is a huge big knife, and carry it back on her back. No mother is going to use that hard-earned piece of wood to boil up milk, water, because nurse says so.
And in our area, water is a problem.
What do you mean water is a problem?
Well, in 1967, when Caracas was 400 years old, the government put water into almost all of the barrios. But it only comes in every second or third day. And so it has to be stored in big oil drums. And during the last 2 years in the city, we've had problems with water supply. And in 2 of the sections where I work, the water is brought in cistern-like trucks. And also another feature very common, and of course, when I speak, I don't have the medical background or, say, even the sensitivity to of a clinic or that some of my colleagues here would have. But I have seen many sick babies. People bringing babies to me, would you please baptize them? Babies had diarrhea for 5 days. I think the baby's going to die. Or the same thing, asking for money to go to the doctor. Like Jamaica and other countries, our people tend to autorecetarse. That is, they determine which medicine they'll take. For example, if you get a cold, people offer you 5 or 6 different medicines. So if their baby begins to become sick or starts to cry, many mothers who are breastfeeding say, well, the baby wasn't satisfied, she was crying. So I started on the infant formula. Now, one thing I have a lot of competency in is in the education level of the people, since I worked in many different kinds of education projects. Our illiteracy rate in Venezuela is very low in comparison to other Latin American countries. It's 26%. However, in the barrio, that's where all of the illiterate people of the country are, so it would be closer to 50%. And what we find in this kind of situation is that our people only read headlines. They're very visual in that sense. Also, one time with some seminarians, Venezuelan seminarians in the parish, we did a study along lines of Latin American educational trends of what were the key words, what we call the generative words for the people. We came up with 109 words, and all of the words were very concrete. None of the 109 words had more than 3 syllables. And yet, if you take a look at the kind of cans that are used in Caracas, and here I have the S26 formula can, you'll see that the directions are in very small print. The kind of print our people never even look at, because 50% are illiterate, and another 20% would be functionally illiterate, and these would be government statistics. And all this can of S26 says is that you should mix this solution in water previamente hervida, previously boiled. A 5-syllable word, and hervida they would understand. But in that very small language, I doubt they would even read it. Once again, you have a picture of a happy little boy here. In a culture that is 70% mestizo, he really is very white.
What are the health consequences of this in terms of the infant? When you find that the father isn't able to afford the continued supply of the formula, what did you find from your own work was the health problem for the infant?
What happens is that the mother just dilute the formula, puts the water which is not even clean, and just put a little so as the water will have the milk coloring, which now leads to deprivation in nutrition.
Why does the mother do this? Why does the mother start off down this road? If she might hear, why does she do it?
Well, because they cannot afford.
But why do they get started in buying the formula?
Well, the thing is, it's a sort of a system wherein we health workers know the havoc or the economic problems, and yet we seem that we cannot get off the ground in really implementing. It is in the implementing of breastfeeding. So from the very start, babies are separated from their mothers at the hospital and are mostly started on bottle feeding.
We believe it is simplistic and dangerous to contend that more breastfeeding and less formula feeding will solve the nutritional and health problems of infants in the developing world. We believe that the effects of poverty, lack of food and safe drinking water, the absence of sanitation, and the shortage of health care are the primary causes of disease and death among infants in the developing world.
Formula preparation is done under very unhygienic conditions. So you get diarrhea, you get vomiting.
But wouldn't they have gotten that anyway from drinking the water? Wouldn't the infants have gotten that in any event if they've been drinking the water?
Well, I mean, naturally the baby's going to drink the water because it's thirsty. So mother's just going to take it right out of the river, give it to the baby. She's going to make up her formula out of the river. And as I said, the baby is normally not in A1 health as we'd find on those posted tins or so. So this, once it starts taking the formula and it's got constant attacks of diarrhea and vomiting, naturally its resistance in health is going down. The intestinal digestive tract has lost resistance against any other disease too. So in the jungle we have a measles, which is very virulent. It's called black measles. And I only wish that all these agents selling these formulas could see the way these poor children die is like flies. It's like going around with a fly spray, spraying 1 million flies to death. Within a week we can lose. Can any father imagine losing 3 or 4 children in the same family within a week just due to measles, which has come as an epidemic because of malnutrition?
Let me, if we understand the the river is contaminated. If it's your professional opinion as a nurse that if they use the breastfeeding, that the child would not be contaminated, or the risks are much less than if they're using a formula which necessitates using the river water, which is contaminated, and that the infant's ability to resist infection, obviously, is much less if they're very small than if they're somewhat older, a year or at the end of the time that they breastfeed. Do I understand your position correctly? Is that a description of what the conditions are in these tribal areas?
Point here about this whole situation, which I think is very important. It's well recognized that breast milk has protective effects against infection. But what I don't think is as clearly recognized, well, I think that the evidence is only just coming to the fore, is that when babies are fed on breast milk, it actually allows them to develop their own resistance to infection better. So a child who is fed on breast milk is more efficient at developing his own resistance. So even if he is presented with contaminated water, he's going to be better able to deal with it than a child who is fed on a formula where he has a decreased capacity to develop his own resistance, and so for the same infective amount of water, he's going to be in a more powerless situation.
Just by giving back the babies to their mothers and not using any infant formula at the nursery, we were able to put down our deaths and diseases.
By the change of the bottle or the formula feeding back to the breastfeeding, is that correct?
Well, mainly, what we were doing before was we kept the baby at the nursery, gave them bottle feeding. A majority of the babies were on bottle feeding. In the second step, what we did was we tried to reverse our figure. Our breastfeeding went up to 81%, and this is the result that we got. And in fact, it is reflected in the infant mortality rate in our city, which is now only 25.5. And the overall infant mortality in the Philippines is around 74 or 76. Just by doing the natural way, keeping the babies where they belong to their mothers.
Those are dramatic figures.
Yes.
Serious concerns regarding the effect of prepared infant formula products on feeding practices in the Third World were first brought to my attention in 1970 at a meeting held in Bogota, Colombia, sponsored by the various United Nations organizations. At that meeting, medical and nutritional experts debated the issue vigorously, but disagreed substantially on the impact of the availability and promotion of formulas on a perceived decline in breastfeeding in developing nations. They also disagreed on whether infant morbidity and mortality rates in general were linked in a significant way to the use of formulas.
All right. Now, what is the actions of the government in Jamaica taken recently about this?
In the recent past, since the first breastfeeding study was done 10 years ago, when the results of that came to light, the government banned the mass media advertising of infant formula.
So how do they get information now? Is it directly from the doctors themselves?
And
limited to that?
And the milk nurses. Following on that, there was a very definite influence of the milk nurses, both among all sectors of the society. The government then brought in...
Just briefly describe what a milk nurse is. We'll hear about it later on, but give it quickly.
A milk nurse is a qualified nurse who is employed by a company that produces, manufactures, distributes an infant proprietary formula to act as a sales representative on their behalf to promote that formula. directly to the mothers and to health professionals.
They work in the clinics? Do they work in the clinics?
They used to work in the clinic, but the government has banned them from going into the clinic, and now their work is based in private hospitals, or was based in private hospitals, and visiting mothers at home in the shortly after the baby was born.
Now they're banned now?
They had been banned for a long time.
Why were they banned?
Because it was felt that their presence in hospitals having an early effect on mothers was likely to influence mothers towards bottle feeding at an early stage, which was considered undesirable.
And why was the advertising banned?
The advertising was banned because it was felt generally that within our situation, within the whole socio-economic status of our country, that bottle feeding presents a positive, dangerous threat to the health of our children.
I think there is a need for consciousness raising in policymakers that the nutrition of the mother and young child is very important for national development, that the breastfeeding is an important component of this, and that the influence of the infant food industry needs scrutiny to see its relevance or otherwise. There is a need, I believe, for a monitoring process which has been shown to be needed in a free market enterprise economy in other industries.
I'm the director of the Infant Formula Program for the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and in my capacity, I've collected a lot of data and I have presented it over the years to the companies themselves. I think I'd like to just start in the Philippines because we've talked so much about it. So in some of our data we've collected, things like this have come out. On a Del Monte plantation, which is a workers' plantation, in the clinic there, Enfamil is given out, which is a Bristol-Myers formula free. Mead Johnson, which is the Bristol-Myers subsidiary, has practically equipped that entire nursery, supplying bassinets, scales, clocks, air conditioning, etc. In other hospitals in the Philippines, Nestle Corporation has name tags on the cribs of babies. The wristbands that they have also have the name of the formula on it. In one hospital that we surveyed, where 90% of the patients were poverty patients, 3 companies, American Home, Wyeth Division, Mead Johnson, Bristol-Myers, and Nestle's had a closed marketing arrangement with the hospital where each company would be allowed 15 days in rotation to give out their free samples. To quote a doctor from Malaysia on this problem, which he discussed this at the International Pediatric Conference in New Delhi. He said, this is Dr. Abraham, quote, "The milk companies have gained access to the health services in government and private sectors with advertising, posters, pamphlets, and free samples. These are difficult to resist because they are given free and to inexperienced health staff and seem only to be offers of much needed help." One of our investigators just wrote me from the Dominican Republic a few weeks ago, about a month ago actually, where she was investigating the problem. And right across the hall from the rehydration ward, which is where they bring back the sick babies, there was a classroom, and outside the classroom was a little bronze plaque, and it said "Classroom donated by Nestle." And inside there were lots of posters, there was formula displayed, etc.
In the Philippines, 27% of mothers coming from urban economically advantaged backgrounds were given free milk samples while in hospital. Among the urban poor, 9% received free samples, and significantly, in the case of the rural population that was studied, 41% of those who were delivered in hospitals had been given milk samples. In Guatemala, the social group most exposed to this practice was the urban poor. 19% of those who were delivered in hospital were given samples. In Nigeria, 23% of the urban economically advantaged were given samples, and 10% of the urban poor. Our data also indicate that the exposure of mothers to industrially processed and commercially marketed infant foods was extensive. Knowledge of brand names was almost universal throughout the economically advantaged populations in all 9 countries. This was also true of the urban poor and rural communities of Chile, Guatemala, and the Philippines. In the case of the Philippines, for example, all the mothers in the urban poor and rural communities new products by their name. And in Nigeria, 72% of the urban poor mothers also knew products by their brand name. The data on the subject of marketing and distribution of infant foods were collected and analyzed for WHO by Professor Bo Wikström, Professor of Marketing and Business Administration at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. 4 countries, Ethiopia, Nigeria, the Philippines, and India, were covered in this survey. In these 4 countries, altogether 42 transnational companies representing 13 countries were operating. In the case of Ethiopia, Nigeria, and the Philippines, the infant food market was almost totally supported by imported products. In India, there was a significant national production. A wide variety of distribution networks were being used. In different settings and to varying degrees, infant foods were distributed through food stores, including kiosks and market stalls, pharmacies, hospitals, and health services. Altogether, about half of the companies that were studied used nurses as part of the distribution network.
Competitive marketing of infant formula produces no inherent benefits for the population of a developing nation. Price competition is rarely vigorous in LDC markets, creating little of the consumer benefit economists normally attribute to market competition. In the past, the industry has argued that freedom of consumer choice was reason enough to allow its products to be sold, and that they were not responsible for the lack of pure water, the poverty, or the illiteracy of the population. But that argument cannot legitimize a product whose misuse is predictable and calculable. In our research in Colombia, for example, it was learned that only 29% of rural populations and 72% of urban populations had the potable water required for mixing with powdered infant formula. And yet formula was available to consumers and promoted to health personnel throughout that nation. No manager familiar with this issue could authorize distribution and marketing in Colombia without also knowing that there was a high probability of misuse by as much as 71% of the rural population and 28% of the urban population.
Well, isn't really that the crux of the problem? I mean, how do you justify the promotion of a product when you know that, as your figures point out here, that 72% of the urban population have potable do not have the potable water to be able to mix it with the infant formula. And yet there is the promotion for that particular formula. I mean, isn't that really the issue in terms of what the corporate responsibility is?
I think that is the issue.
Would you agree with me that your product should not be used where there is impure water? Yes or no?
We give all the instructions.
Just answer. What is your position?
Of course not, but we cannot cope with that.
Do you think that your product ought to be used in areas where there's illiteracy, vast illiteracy?
Pardon?
Where there is illiteracy?
Well, that's
people can't read.
Yes, but that is very difficult to control, Senator, because you go in a region and they are not all illiterate. There are some who are. How can you control that the product goes to one rather than to the other?
Well, as I understand what you say is where there's impure water, it should not be used.
Yes.
Where the people are so poor that they're not going to realistically be able to continue to purchase that, and which is going to mean that they're going to dilute it to a point,
yes,
which is going to endanger the health, that it should not be used.
Yes.
All right, now, then my final question is what do you do, or what do you feel is your corporate responsibility to find out the extent of the use of your product in those circumstances in the developing part of the world? Do you feel that you have any responsibility?
We can't have that responsibility, sir. May I make a reference to...
you can't have that responsibility?
No. How can I be responsible for the water system?
Not talking. I'm talking about the use of your product in those areas.
But...
Do you feel that the corporation has any responsibility to know whether your product is being just occasionally used in those or widely used in those areas? Or do you feel that your corporation doesn't have any responsibility whatsoever?
With your permission, sir, even in the state of São Paulo, where we have 10 million people today, a great part of the water system is no good. I can't help it.
That's interesting to us. I mean, if we're just, if your company thinks the world's São Paulo's, all over there, and therefore we don't have to care very much. That's interesting to us.
I don't think that's what I said, Senator, but we do not want our product used by women improperly. We do not want it made available to women.
Well, do you do anything to prevent it, or what do you do?
Well, we don't. One, as a matter of business practice, our customers tend to be, as I'm advised by our foreign managers, tend to be the middle class of those countries. And the abject poor in the rural environment is not the customers that we target at. One, often they cannot afford the product, and we don't target.
You don't target, but do you know what gets into those into the poor people?
If the product gets there, we hope that they will have a company.
Well, do you know whether it does get there?
Yes, the product is available in stores.
Well, do you know what percentage does get there and is not being used correctly? Do you have any idea?
Yes.
The World Health Organization feels that it's an important health hazard.
For 8 years, the industry's critics have borne the burden of proving that there was a connection between commercial marketing practices and the infant malnutrition and morbidity which have been discussed this morning. These hearings seem to me to signal a turning point, because from this time forward, the sellers will have to bear the burden of proving that their products are not only desired, but actually serve a public purpose in the developing world.
We hear over and over again that we are making the very best possible product, and there are some mothers and infants who need to use this, and we will accept that. But they do not seem ready to accept responsibility for limiting their promotion methods, their sales methods, their marketing methods. And it is my conviction that if you can reach the remote village by Cessna and Jungle Trail with the product, you can also reach it with controlled business ethics.
To bring in a charge like this, that the Worldwide Church Organization has the stated purpose of undermining the free enterprise system, just doesn't advance the cause at all, nor your argument, may I suggest.
I must say that I was led to them because I was surprised with two things. One, the boycott which is made against one company which does not manufacture these products in the States. And second, because of the film which has been distributed under the title of Bottle Babies to many local churches and schools, where the emotional responses necessary for the boycott attempt are made.
The boycott is a recognized tool in a free economic democratic system, and it is used in our society.